In this module we're going to cover the 24 Tirthankaras and also the life of Nataputta Vardhamana, whose title is Mahavira, which means something like great hero, but more on that later. First, the 24 Tirthankaras. The term translates as something like ford makers. The term ford has to do with finding a shallow place in a river where you can cross, so you ford the river, so to speak. So the implication is that these people are guiding us across the river of life to total liberation. The cycles of time in Jainism are vast, millions and millions of years, and actually each cycle consists of two different phases. One is an ascending phase, during which time there's happiness and enlightenment, morality, etc. And then there is a descending phase where happiness decreases, morality decreases, virtue decreases, and we're currently in one of those phases, a descending phase. Well, it's said that all 24 Tirthankaras have appeared during this phase of descent. And the idea is that a Tirthankara will appear to sort of put us back on course, so to speak. They can anticipate that things are degenerating spiritually and morally, and they will appear to get us back on track. There have been a total of 24 according to Jain tradition, although really only the last two are known as historical figures. And the vastness of time that's suggested by Jain tradition tells us that the other 22, or the existence of the other 22, is problematic, at least in real world terms. The 24 Tirthankaras are all depicted almost identically in identical poses, and there is one thing, however, that marks each Tirthankara as different from the other, and that is a particular animal that is used to represent a particular Tirthankara. In fact, that's how you can tell them apart. So, for example, the 23rd Tirthankara, Parshva, who actually was followed by Mahavira's parents, is depicted with a snake. Mahavira is depicted with a lion. So that way you can tell the difference between the different Tirthankara. By the way, Mahavira is considered to be more or less a popularizer of Jainism, certainly not the founder in a technical sense, since it's thought that Jainism is an ancient tradition that was around before Mahavira was born. But Mahavira, being a Tirthankara, popularized the teachings of Jainism, and in fact it is said that he added chastity to the virtues of Jainism. One other note about the Tirthankaras, there are two major sects of Jainism, the Svetambaras and the Digambaras, and we'll talk about those in another module, but please note here that the Svetambaras believe that the 19th Tirthankara was actually a female, whereas the Digambaras reject the notion that a female can be a Tirthankara. So that might be one slight other difference between the various Tirthankaras. Mahavira is the 24th and final Tirthankara that will appear during this particular cycle. He was born in 597 BCE, a few decades before the Buddha was born. So as I've mentioned in the last module, he was a slightly older contemporary of the Buddha. It's not known whether or not they actually met one another. But as fate would have it, he was also born in Bihar and lived most of his life there, the very area where the Buddha spent most of his time. It is said that Mahavira was conceived by a woman in the Brahmin Varna, the highest of the four Varnas, and that there was a miraculous embryo transplant that occurred so that Nadaputa Vardhamana could be born to a Kshatriya woman, a woman in the Kshatriya Varna, because it is said that his destiny would not fulfill itself if he didn't, in fact, have the right sort of birth. So what we have, in effect, is another virgin birth, since the woman who actually birthed him did not have sexual relations. So he was born into a family of royalty, and he was a prince, just like Siddhartha. And in fact, he lived a pampered existence for 29 years, also, just like Siddhartha did. It's said that he was married, even had a daughter, but at age 30, after his parents died, he gave away all of his belongings and joined in with a group of ascetics and began a 12-year period of extreme austerity, asceticism, fasting, and so forth. In fact, in the annals of religious literature, you could hardly find anyone who practiced asceticism like Mahavira practiced asceticism. It is said that he basically hung out with these 5 other ascetics for a while, but then eventually he even abandoned clothing and struck out on his own, totally nude, without any belongings. And the sutras, which is scriptures from Jainism associated with the Tirthankaras sect, actually describes episodes in his life at that time, and I'll read some passages from these sutras or scriptures for you, describing the life of Mahavira during this ascetic period. Thoroughly knowing the earth bodies and water bodies and fire bodies and wind bodies, the lichens, seeds, and sprouts, he comprehended, that's Mahavira, that they are, if narrowly inspected, imbued with life, and avoided to injure them. Walking, he meditated with his eyes fixed on a spare space before him of the length of a man, looking a little sideward, looking behind, attentively looking on his path. He walked so as not to step on any living thing. Many sorts of living beings gathered on his body, crawled about it, and caused pain there. But he exercised self-control so as not to scratch himself. Without ceasing in his reflections, the Venerable One slowly wandered about, and killing no creatures, he begged for his food. It said he also began to use a broom to sweep in front of him so as not to walk on and injure living beings. Also, he would use a piece of cloth to filter his water, and so forth. In regard to his asceticism, here's another passage. This is the rule followed by the Venerable One. When the cold season has halfway advanced, the houseless one, leaving off his robe and stretching out his arms, should wander about, not leaning against a tree trunk. When a cold wind blows in which some feel pain, then some houseless monks in the cold rain seek a place sheltered from the wind. We shall put on more clothes. Kindling wood or well covered, we shall be able to bear the painful influence of the cold. But the Venerable One desired nothing of the kind. Strong in control, he suffered, despising all shelter. Sometimes in the cold season, the Venerable One was meditating in the shade. In summer, he exposed himself to the heat. He sat squatting in the sun. The Venerable One did not seek sleep for the sake of pleasure. He waked up himself and slept only little. Purgatives and emetics, anointing of the body and bathing, shampooing and cleansing of the teeth do not behoove him. Of course, he was quite indifferent to the abuse of others, and here's a passage that describes that. For some it is not easy to do what he did, not to answer those who salute. He was beaten with sticks and struck by sinful people, giving up the company of all householders whomsoever he meditated. Asked, he gave no answer. Disregarding slights difficult to bear, the sage wandered about, not attracted by storytellers, pantomimes, songs, fights at the quarterstaff, and boxing matches. The dogs bit him, ran at him. Few people kept off the attacking, biting dogs. Striking the monk, they cried cuckoo, and made the dogs bite him. When he once sat without moving his body, they cut his flesh, tore his hair, covered him with dust. Throwing him up, they let him fall, or disturbed him in his religious postures. Abandoning the care of his body, the venerable one humbled himself. And then it is said, after approximately 12 years of this kind of behavior, in which he took extreme pains not to injure any form of life or to be attached to any earthly thing, he attained Kavala, perfect consciousness, or moksha, and was liberated. And it is said at that time that he was completely omniscient. He knew all things, past, present, and future, but he was still a man with a physical body. And so in the Jain spiritual path, he had reached, in fact, the 13th stage of gunasthana, referred to as omniscient with activities. In other words, he had attained nirvana or enlightenment just as the Buddha had, but he was still on earth just as the Buddha remained, until at age 72 he would die, and then at that point he would attain the final stage of gunasthana, which is omniscience without activity. Before he died, however, he committed himself to teaching nonviolence, loving compassion, open-mindedness or relativity, ahimsa, and so forth. It is said that when he sensed death was near, he engaged in the Jain ritual known as salakana. Basically, this involves an individual sitting in place and ceasing the intake of any food, any water. They stop talking, they stop communicating, they stop moving as much as is possible, and eventually, of course, they stop breathing. It's the ultimate spiritual gesture, according to Jains. It is not suicide. We're not talking about suicide here, because Jains, in fact, consider suicide to be wrong. This is more of a spiritual gesture toward all things, because actually, if you think about it, salikana involves the total non-disruption and non-injury of everything around them. So Mahavira expired at age 72.